Tom Woods Show, episode 2171.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Folks, if you enjoy the Tom Woods Show, it's time to go to the next level. And next level Tom Woods is libertyclassroom.com. This is where my friends and I teach all the stuff you did not get in your conventional education. History, economics, and more, the way it ought to be taught, with all the content they left out or distorted. Check it out at libertyclassroom.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. I am delighted to welcome to the show today Richard Hanania, who is president of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. I've just gotten to know about him and his work, and he writes so effectively and convincingly about such an array of topics that interest me that I had to have him on, and particularly after a number of my listeners demanded, you've got to talk to this guy. And then I find out he's this young pup compared to the old man here, and I'm just even more impressed. So this is going to be rather a potpourri episode where I just want to touch on a bunch of things, introduce him to you guys, and maybe have him back on for a more in-depth conversation about some of these topics in the future. So Richard, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
All right, look, I got turned on to you by folks I have a private group for listeners of the show here, and I had people saying, you got to get this guy on. I thought, well, I'm pretty sure I know all the people who are influential in this. And then I read your Substack, and I thought, holy cow, why do I not know this guy? So I have done my penance. I'm following you on Twitter now. I read what you put out. And the only problem I had was we have a limited time today, and there are about 800 gazillion topics we could cover. So I want to cover something that's been a little bit of a theme of the past few episodes here, because you have a bit of a unique take on it. I did an episode on the problem of woke HR departments, which is a problem. I got a lot of feedback from people who are enduring that kind of nightmare. And then I did one with a guy named Michael Rechtenwald, who's an ex-Marxist from NYU, who is doing a book on what he calls woke capitalism. But then I read your take on it, where you're not quite as pessimistic as some conservatives are, that this is a permanent phenomenon that will be around with us forever, that's going to destroy our civilization. Number one, you're not convinced of that. And number two, you think that, I'm sorry, this is the longest preface in the history of this podcast, but some of us say the woke phenomenon shows that libertarians have kind of been getting things wrong, pinning everything on the state, when this seems to be a spontaneous private phenomenon among private firms, and you don't buy that either. So give us your take on all this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the perception that basically, a lot of critics of libertarianism on the right will make this argument. Just look at how bad the corporations are. Look at the stuff that they're telling people. People don't really know the history here. I mean, these things were fought over for decades. So, for example, you might not know this. A lot of people don't know this. There's an executive order that requires every government contractor, every corporation that has a government contract, to practice affirmative action. The government actually spells out, the Department of Labor tells you that you classify all your employees by race and sex. You see how many are in each category of jobs. And then you go out and you're supposed to set goals and timetables. This is to make up for any deficiencies and below the what you'd expect from the local population or whatever. And so this is just one example. Federal contractors, they cover something like 25% of the workforce in the United States because pretty much not every big corporation, but a lot of big corporations do have government contractors. So this is just one aspect of it. There's also something called the disparate impact doctrine. Basically, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and people think that it just means, you can't have a sign that says no Black people or no Mexicans or whatever. No, actually, it's been interpreted by the courts and the federal bureaucracy to say anything that you potentially do, if you give a test or something that has a disparate impact on one group, is potentially illegal. You have to justify it. And what they do is they go after things like standardized tests. You can be sued. You could also be sued under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act for harassment, discrimination. One of the defenses to these kinds of lawsuits is that you have a training program, you have procedure in the sexual harassment context in particular. I mean, courts have explicitly said having a grievance procedure is a kind of defense that people have to go through. You can go beyond business to the universities. People might know about the Obama administration's Title IX regulations that came out of the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education. So there's a lot of this stuff. And we just don't know the level of wokeness that would be without sort of the invisible hand of government pushing institutions in this direction. I wrote this stuff up, and apparently people are surprised. People just don't know the law. They look at the surface phenomenon and they don't really know what's going on underneath.
Well, I just did an episode about the problem with the HR departments being woke. And what somebody, my guest, Kevin Dolan, who was in one of these rare cases, he was a guy who, posted politically incorrect tweets, and that this was discovered, and he wound up losing his job over it. And he said that really what goes on in a lot of these cases, it's not so much that the people running the company are themselves really offended by what I said or anything like that. It's more a defense mechanism that if somebody else comes along and complains that I've done something insensitive toward that person's group, they can point and say, look, you knew this guy was a bad apple. You had evidence already and you didn't. And so now I'm suing for workplace harassment and discrimination that was knowingly made possible by a negligent bunch of corporate leaders. And so it's to protect them against this because of the Civil Rights Acts, that, of course, that allow for people to claim discrimination or claim this or that on the basis of all kinds of things happening to them. The problem is the civil rights laws seem to be pretty well embedded in American society, and there are hundreds of thousands, probably maybe not quite that many, but there are an awful lot of lawyers who make their entire livings on the basis of this. It seems like that would be rather a tough nut to crack.
It would be, but, things have gone in the wrong direction. And maybe knowing how things have gone in the wrong direction could, maybe point us in the right direction. So, for example, there was something called the Civil Rights Act of 1991, signed by George H.W. Bush. It added punitive damages. So before this, you could just, you could recover something from a civil rights lawsuit. Now you can recover, it's capped at a few $100,000 or something, depending on the corporation, but you can do class action. So you could have these things where you just give a bunch of Black people or a bunch of women, $100,000 each. And of course, lawyers' fees and all that stuff. Civil rights law is unique in this way that if you lose a civil rights case, basically the judge can make the defense pay for the plaintiff's attorney's fees. And that's usually not the American system. Most lawsuits, you pay for your own attorneys. But this stuff can be corrected. Legislation is hard, but the original ruling that gave us the disparate impact standard, Griggs versus Duke Power Company, has been criticized pretty heavily by Supreme Court justices. So people like Scalia and Thomas, they've written dissents and concurrences where they say this is basically nonsense. We have a conservative Supreme Court now, so it's not unthinkable that they would revisit that. There's an argument to be made. And Scalia made this case. And keep bringing up these Supreme Court justices because I'm showing you these arguments aren't like radical. They're not coming out of left field. They're within the mainstream of conservative jurisprudence. Mm-hmm. So in the Ricci case of the firefighter, Scalia's concurrence brought up the idea that, disparate impact requires explicit discrimination against a group. So you don't want to have too many white people relative to Black people. So what ends up is government is forcing you to discriminate against white people. That's arguably unconstitutional. And so this is not a radical theory that basically government cannot engage in discrimination. You just need to, I think, get the right cases before the courts. And I think you need to raise the salience of this stuff within sort of the conservative movement and in conservative media. I don't think that these are, radical ideas. I think there are some ideas that are pretty easy sells to people who are conservative or a libertarian bent that can make a huge difference.
You say at one point in one of your pieces that you're not convinced when people say that wokeism is like a ersatz religion for some people. One reason I'm glad you think that is that there are religions that have been around for thousands of years. And I really don't want to think about Western civilization going on like this for thousands of years. And at one point you said something along the lines of that we have to remember that wokeism has never really been given a real stress test, and that it really actually is very politically unpopular with an awful lot of people. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by it hasn't been given a stress test?
Well, if you look at religions, they've in many cases have survived for thousands of years. They've survived when they've had government power on their side. They've survived when government's been indifferent and given people liberty. And they've also survived sometimes, trials of fire. They've survived oppression. This is true of Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Wokeness is not like this. Wokeness, I would argue, was created by government. 100% of its existence has been under a regime that gives it support. That's basically the root of a lot of these ideas. And it's still not popular. You ask people about affirmative action, you have it go to a referendum or something, it still loses. So I don't think this stuff is as robust as it looks. I think that there have been a lot of bad laws, a lot of bad policies. I think the American conservative movement and the libertarian movement has not been smart about these things. They've just seen it at the surface level and haven't really thought about sort of the laws and regulations that are underlying all this. So, I don't know. As soon as this stuff increases in salience, is brought out to the open, I think things can change.
I feel hopeful about that too. And yet I would say a very strong majority of people, I would tend to bet even a lot of traditional Democratic voters in their heart of hearts think, all right, this has obviously gone a little bit too far. And yet for some reason, it doesn't budge and it just grows and grows and grows. Like just the other night. So I'm in New York City right now as we record this. I haven't been to a Broadway show in over 2 years, and I am kind of a sucker for Broadway. And I was not going to, I didn't get the quote unquote vaccine. And even if I did, I wasn't going to show them proof to get into some play. And I'm certainly not going to go in with a ridiculous mask on my face all night. So they lifted that in July 1st. And they lifted it not because some guy in a lab coat told them it was okay, because they're hemorrhaging money, and they need to get the patrons in the seats. So I'm looking through, I took my daughter, we went to see Dear Evan Hansen. And for the first time ever, I was looking through the playbill for the first time ever, next to each actor's name is the preferred pronouns. I've never seen that. And so it's absolutely, now on the other hand, the theater is a rather self-selected group, right? I'm sure if I, went to some rural church in Iowa, the pastoral staff would not have their pronouns listed in the church bulletin. I get that. How do we account for this anomaly? I mean, there are some economic anomalies I can account for that sugar subsidies continue, even though they benefit a tiny minority and they harm everybody else. But that's because the tiny minority benefits so much that they lobby 24 hours a day for it, and the pain is dispersed, so nobody organizes against it. I understand that. But how in a thing like this, where the things we're being asked to believe are ridiculous on their face and nobody really believes it, how do you account for why it persists?
Yeah, I mean, one of my sort of ideas that I've brought up before is I think that there's a certain kind of person who goes into an occupation for the prestige rather than the money. They're less financially motivated than others. And I'm thinking specifically about journalism and academia. I mean, these can draw idealistic people, but it can also draw people who are, idealistic, but with some very bad ideas, or people who are driven by status and feeling better than other people. So I think these are feels like this are sort of the strongholds of wokeism. As far as, the financial incentives, I mean, an entire industry has grown up around this stuff. So one of the things I mentioned in my piece is that the field of HR, the number of people working in human resources, just takes off after the Civil Rights Act. I mean, every business had to, start bean counting, had to start looking over its shoulders. Every major corporation, just Google the name of any corporation, they've been sued or they've had a settlement over some kind of discrimination because, there's always disparities in whatever selection criteria you use. Harassment is sort of a vague standard. So I think to a large extent, they are following their financial interests. Maybe they go beyond that. But I mean, like sort of parasitic industries, these HR people and these DEI people who have an incentive to basically sell their own services. Sometimes these things are, required by law. So, the Department of Education requires a Title IX coordinator, or at least it did under the Obama administration. It has all these other requirements about, what the Title IX coordinator should be doing and how much staff you should have in order to, enforce Title IX. And so, yeah, mentioning pronouns, it's really not something that costs that much. But a lot of these things, where you're foregoing merit and you're doing all this kind of bean counting and record keeping and, looking over your shoulder, that certainly has a cost, but it's a cost that businesses think it's worth paying because, the government's got a sort of a boot on their neck and they have to always worry about that.
All right, since we're doing a kind of Richard Hanania, potpourri episode, let's say, I want to shift gears completely and talk about something completely different, just because this is, again, a topic where I like what you have to say, and it's not popular, and that's the Ukraine and Russia issue. Mm-hmm. And in particular, what I've been trying to find out from anybody here, now I've heard it said by some people that the Ukrainian military is on the verge of collapse, and the final word is going to be said on this conflict sometime next month. But I don't know. I've been hearing that for a while. So I've been trying to ask people, what is, other than absolute 100% total domination by Russia, if there had been an attempt to negotiate through this, what would have been a plausible goal for impartial negotiators in this situation to aim at?
I think you could have got some kind of, maybe, and who knows if Russia and Ukraine would have agreed to this. But, I talk about what the U.S. should have been pushing for. And I think that it should have been something like acknowledging Russia had made some gains, the pre-February 24th borders. I mean, Crimea is not going back. The Donetsk and Luhansk regions are not going back. And then no NATO expansion. I mean, I think what's, been proven here is that Ukraine can defend itself. It doesn't need a NATO guarantee. I mean, it needs, weapons and support for the West. But I think the NATO thing was really, symbolic here. And it was very important to Russia. And I think the rights of the Russian speakers in the East were also important to Russia. And so, I think it was at least worth trying. I mean, the whole point of NATO, bringing Ukraine into NATO would have been to deter a Russian attack. Well, you didn't want to promise no NATO expansion. And so you got the Russia attack anyway. So what was the whole point of not seriously negotiating on this? And, the sad part, nobody can say for sure what would have happened. The sad thing is that they never even tried. I mean, Biden and Blinken, Putin would say, we want this guarantee on NATO. And Biden and Blinken would say, let's talk about nuclear weapons and the stationing of nuclear weapons in Europe. I mean, they would say it's non-negotiable. And they were saying this up to the moment, until pretty much until now. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. It could do it. Yeah, it can, but the U.S. can decide, it's not worth having Ukraine as part of NATO. So that's the tragedy here. People are too confident in what they think, could have happened or could have been done differently. I think it was at least worth trying getting some kind of peace deal, but unfortunately, we never really did.
So let's say that the thing does end next month and Russia more or less winds up with everything it wants. How could Biden possibly spin this as a victory? I mean, he's been borderline assuring us that the economic sanctions and sending all the money over there is going to hold back the Russians, because if we let them take Ukraine, then who knows what they'll do next. But if after all that they take Ukraine anyway, how does this work for him? I don't understand. What's his message coming out of this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen any strong arguments that Ukraine is ready to collapse and Russia is going to take everything. I mean, people make different predictions based on sort of what side they're on, and I've heard it sort of both ways. I mean, the most likely thing, it's going to be a small war of attrition. One side is going to gain land here and one side is going to gain the other. As long as that's going on, I think that, Biden can sell it as not, people have already to a large extent forgotten about Ukraine. It's important to elites. It's not the most important thing by far to the American public. I think that what matters for Biden's political fortunes as far as Ukraine goes is the effect on the global economy. And this has been painful for the global economy. If it continues being like that, if things get really bad in Europe, if that has knockoff effects in the United States, then I think they would worry a lot more. But I don't know. I don't think there's any I think this is too deeply embedded in the American foreign policy establishment. I think they really dislike Russia and they really are angry about Russian behavior. I don't think they're even following political motivations here. I think they're going to basically stick with the current policy, indefinitely.
Before I go on, let me say a quick thing that will help a lot of you, and you know who you are. If you are in business and you're getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO, our great sponsor. If you're a small local business, you're trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, increase your visibility with Persist SEO. Or if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis, well, website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. If you're tired of cold calling, use your website as a lead generation engine. If you're not showing up for your services on the search engines, then get found with Persist SEO's expert search engine optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help. You spent some time at the School for International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. What kind of work did you do there?
International relations. I mean, I would just, publish papers and publish my book there.
And what kind of stuff have you dealt with when it comes to international relations? Because I'm curious about, are we moving more clearly into a multipolar rather than a unipolar world? And what are the implications of that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that the rise of China, is somewhat inevitable. They're actually, maybe not. I mean, they're sort of shooting themselves in the foot with the COVID hysteria. But until recently, I thought that they were clearly going to be a rival source of power in the world, and they're still going to be. I mean, they have to think that they'll get over this COVID craziness at some point and go back to growing. And the U.S. is not going to maintain its position in East Asia to the extent that it does now. But I think actually, other than China and East Asia, there's really not a rival threat to the United States. And the U.S. can maintain power even with a relatively smaller economy, just because it cares that much about foreign affairs and is willing to invest more in its military and willing to impose costs. A lot of this stuff is sort of a legacy power, and some countries can maintain power long after they're. And there's not really somebody to replace this. It's not like the Europeans are economic juggernauts, or there's any growing economic juggernaut in Latin America. Things I think are probably going to get very bad for Europe before they get better. They have demographic problems, and also they're apparently going to freeze this winter in Germany. So they're going to have some long-term damage, I think, to their industry. I think the idea that America is going to decline relative to the rest of the world, I think it's been oversold a bit. I think the rise of China is real. But besides that, I think, for better or worse, U.S. is going to be, powerful on the global stage, definitely into the future.
Now, again, jumping around just because I'm kind of introducing you to my audience, and there's so many things I want to ask you about because I've been kind of on a binge reading some of your stuff. What do you think the progressive movement has, if anything, to teach those of us who are non-progressives? Because the fact is they're pretty successful. They very often define the debate, and they define what's allowable and what's not allowable in terms of opinion. Is there anything we can learn from them?
Yeah, I think that one thing you should learn from progressives is that public opinion is very malleable. If you sit there and you just look at an opinion poll and say people support X more than Y, and you're just going to therefore do X, you're not going to get anywhere. I think that the thing that progressives do is every battle is followed up by something, pushing further. So they wanted equal, it's like with every identity group, they get equal treatment. That's what they're selling first. They use this sort of libertarian language. What does it matter if homosexuals get married? Oh, you shouldn't discriminate, against people based on their race. And then the next thing comes, okay, disparate impact. This test is racist because Black people don't do well on it. You have to hire people of different sexual orientation, even if you don't want to. Then this becomes sort of the new norm. They go from equal treatment of women, accepting women, to changing the institution to be more feminized. So I think that there's a benefit to principle and just to keep pushing in a certain direction. If you want to change public policy, I don't think you put your finger in the wind. And a lot of public policy is not made based on election results. Liberals have been doing a very good job of implementing their policies through, the judiciary, through the federal bureaucracy. I think there's been sort of a naivete on the conservative side, just believing they can win elections and that's going to reverse things. It's clearly not. I think you need to think of changing the incentive structure in which people operate. So I'll give one concrete example because this is all on a very generalizable, very general level. Something like school choice, I think, should be at the top of the priority list. Why? What does it do? It takes money away from public education system. The public education system is the root of a lot of our evil. I think we knew they were woke before. I think with the COVID hysteria, I don't think anyone can doubt that. So Arizona just had what looks like the first universal voucher program where they basically will give you money. And it's a substantial amount of money. I think it's $6,000 or $7,000 per child. If you want to check out of the public education system, use it for private school, use it for homeschooling. Scott Walker, a decade ago, brought the hammer down on public sector unions in Wisconsin. I just looked back at, what's happened in Wisconsin since then. Like basically the amount of money the teachers unions are spending lobbying has just collapsed. The state has become more Republican over time. And so, it's who thinks about Scott Walker today? Nobody, but it's a successful use of government power to sort of redistribute power and change the incentive system. So I would argue people should think more carefully about issues like that.
What age were you when you became politically aware, would you say?
I think I was maybe, like 17 or 18. I think I voted for John Kerry in 2004 and Barack Obama. I was living in Illinois, so Obama's first Senate election. I voted for Obama too. And I didn't stay liberal for long, but yeah.
Okay,
I was 18 or 19.
Yeah, I snuck this under the radar here with like 4 minutes to go. so hold on just a minute. Then I'm always curious about people in that kind of situation. I mean, you were young, so you still had an open enough mind, we assume, to consider other options. But was there one aha moment where you said, wait a minute, this whole thing's all wrong, or what happened?
I was sort of opposed to the religious right at the time and Bush's wars in 2004. But then that sort of the opposition to religious right got me actually seriously into sort of evolutionary theory. And then I sort of realized, wait a minute, liberals don't believe in biology. And then, as soon as I started hearing conservative libertarian arguments about economics, it just sort of clicked for me. So it didn't really take that long. I mean, I think I was like 17, 18, just first time paying attention to the media, just sort of digesting what they're telling me. Okay, Bush, seems sort of stupid. He seems to have a lot of bad policies. But, it didn't take long. I mean, by the time I was 19 or 20, I was sort of on the conservative path.
Can you just say a quick word about your organization?
We're the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. So you go to cspicenter.com. We do a lot of great work. We've done stuff on campus freedom. We've done campus climate. We've done stuff on the cost benefit of COVID restrictions. We did recently an essay contest on policy reform for progress. We have a biweekly podcast too, just CSPI podcast you can find anywhere. And check us out. We have a lot of good content there.
All right, I'm going to put all your links up on the show notes page. This is episode 2171. I've been around a while doing these. So it's tomwoods.com/2171. It's a smorgasbord of Richard's material linked there. Well, again, I know we have a time constraint today, and I only wanted to take half an hour of your time anyway, but I appreciate the opportunity to get to know you. I can go back to my folks and say, I talked to him, you were right. I'm glad I did it. And I'll also put a link to your Substack up there because I keep mentioning that. That's very much worth reading. Everything is always blanketyblank.substack.com. What's yours?
Just my name, richardhanania.substack.com.
Okay, so we'll have that up on the show notes page as well. Thanks so much, Richard. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, everybody. Tomorrow you are absolutely not going to want to miss. Yes, the topic has to do with the UK, and I know most of you don't live there, but that doesn't matter because we're talking to Dominic Frisby, who's one of the best people in the world. He is 1,000% on our side, a genuinely good, extremely talented polymath. He has just released a project that will blow you away, especially if you love history. It will just blow you away. We're going to talk about that and compare notes about the madness in the UK versus the madness of the US, see who wins out. So please, 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 do not skip episode 2172. You will love Dominic Frisby. If you haven't heard him on the show before, you'll be in for a real treat. So with that, everybody, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.